All right, well, thanks everybody for being here. I know that folks have choir commitments and other things a little bit later, so we'll try to keep on schedule. It's just now, 6:31 or so, 6:30-ish. So we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for being a part of this and being here and joining via Zoom. We have one person here in the room, so we've got our slides up on the screen. And I'm just so grateful that we can spend this time together. I'm going to give everybody a little bit of a possible sneak peek as well. I'm really enjoying putting these things together, reading up on Caesarea Maritima and learning more about it and putting these things together and remembering seeing this. I'm really interested in following this up during the season of Lent with another staycation around the Holy Land, really focusing in Jerusalem around the end of the life of Jesus. And so if you're enjoying this, that's great. What we may wind up doing is having that as our midweek experience throughout Lent as well. So that's kind of in the works. It's not set in stone just yet, but that's an idea. We would, you'd be welcome to be here in person or again, to join via Zoom, either way. But I'm just really enjoying this. I love the study of history, the study of archaeology, and the study of the Holy Land in particular. And so this is right up that alley. So I hope that, that this is faithful and that you're getting something out of this. So today we get to go on our staycation. Remember last week we were down in the desert south of Jerusalem, up on a wilderness plateau called Masada or Masada, where Herod built his first fortress palace, way out in the desert, on the way headed down south toward Idumea, his home country. We get the sense, just in case he had to flee south from Jerusalem, that would have been his holding place until he made it safely south. Today we get to take a look at Caesarea Maritima. So if you will, again, imagine with me that we have now spent one full day in the Holy Land, and we made our first day trip out to Masada, and we took the cable car up and back down, and we got to take a bunch of great pictures of the ruins there and of the view from the top of the plateau. But we're just absolutely bushed. And so we make our way back up to Jerusalem and find where we're staying and get our things into whether it's a monastery or a hotel for the night and get packed in and get a good night's sleep, because we are taking another day trip. We're going to take a look at something really cool in just a second. I hope it's cool. So our home base is either in Jerusalem, where we're spending our entire trip, or we've made our way north up to Galilee, and that'll be our opening, that'll be our kind of our home spot. So let's have a word of prayer, and then I hope that we can see together something really cool. Let's pray. Good and gracious God, watch over and guide us as we have conversation about Caesarea, a beautiful city, and one that reveals so much about Herod and about his legacy, and even unveils some things about the scriptures for us. Help us to be faithful in this time, in Jesus' name, amen. Okay, let's try Google Earth, because, hey, why not? I don't know how much experience you all have in poking around with Google Earth, but it is an extraordinary thing that the internet provides for us. The internet, I don't know if you know, but it's not all good stuff. A lot of it is trash, but things like Google Earth, I think, help to make it worthwhile. And so I'm hoping against hope that I'm going to click on a link in just a moment. I'm going to try to share my cursor as well. Okay. Anyway, I'm gonna click on this and hope that it shares the way that it has when I was practicing. Google Earth, it's logging us in. Hey, check it out. Okay, so there is a Google Earth look at, it's a very broad shot, but just about the whole Mediterranean Sea off to the west there to our left, and just about the whole Arabian Desert there to our right. So what I'm going to do is play around with this a little bit and see if we can just discover a few things. We're going to zoom out first. This is planet Earth, our home. And everyone that we've ever heard about and all the things that we've ever really known about have taken place right here on our home, the earth. We started our journey at RDU. We can go ahead and do a quick search for that. RDU International Airport. It's going to bring us in tight here to our home environs in Raleigh. I always have to make it stop spinning pretty quickly, but there it is, Raleigh, Durham. We took off from there. Let's imagine just a couple of short days ago. I looked up some flights. It's about $800 to fly from RDU into Tel Aviv, into Ben Gurion Airport, really the only international airport in Israel. And about $800 in a couple of days. You have to make at least one stop in New York and probably two stops, one in Detroit and then in New York. But who wants to do that? So we're going to pull out here from RDU. And we'll take a look at just the vast distance that we're talking about between where our home is and the places that we're talking about. We head across the Atlantic Ocean. Across the Atlantic Ocean. There are some familiar sights along the way. Look at just how vast this ocean is until we finally get to the westernmost points in Europe, like Lisbon, Portugal. We can see North Africa here. We've got the whole Mediterranean Sea out here in front of us now. Europe to the north of it and North Africa to the south of it. Keep going and keep going and keep going until we can see what we call the Holy Land. You can see Jerusalem there within the modern political lines of Israel and the West Bank. You can see Jordan just to its east. So then we're going to pull in a little bit tighter here. We have flown into Tel Aviv, but more specifically, we're flying into Ben Gurion Airport, which is, there it is, which is just outside of Tel Aviv. And so this is where we've landed, Ben Gurion. And on our first stop, if this is making anybody nauseous, just let me know and we'll stop. But for our first stop, we went ahead and drove all the way down to this southern portion of the Dead Sea. And we drove to, we'll be able to see it in just a moment, I'm sure. Well, Masada is around here somewhere. Well, you know what we can do with Google Earth is we can just Google it. Masada National Park. Ah, there it is. I was too far south. All right, stop spinning immediately. And here's Masada. Here's the park. A lot of things around here are named after Masada. But here is the place where we pulled our bus in and kind of took a look around. And then the actual plateau is here. You can see the shape that we looked at, the northern palace and the wall around and all those kind of things. You can even see the snake path kind of snaking up the side there. So for today, we have left away from Masada. We've traveled back north toward Jerusalem. You can see Bethlehem here. That's where Jesus was born. You knew that. Up to Jerusalem, and we're either making Jerusalem our home city while we're in the Holy Land, or maybe we're going all the way up north to Galilee. The Sea of Galilee. On Sunday morning in our reading from Luke, it was called Gennesaret. It's got several different names throughout the Bible. So either way, whether we're staying in, for example, a city like Nazareth, which you can see to your left of the Sea of Galilee, to the west of Galilee, or whether we're staying at one of the kibbutzes right in the Galilee Valley, our next day trip, we're going to take off a little bit south and a little bit further west. And we're looking for a place called Caesarea. Can you see it there, right on the coast? Caesarea is right here on the coast, and we're going to pull in here to Caesarea. Caesarea is still a fully functioning Israeli city. You can see kind of the neighborhoods and settlements right along the major roads here. What we're going to do is pull in a little bit closer to Caesarea National Park, which is the site of the ancient city, still here since the building of it by Herod. And we're going to notice a couple of different things. First, we can notice just kind of the general outline. You can see the parts of the city that are in ruins. But what I would like to do via Google Earth, and kind of the whole reason I decided to do this, was that we can actually see a connection between what's on the land and what's in the water. You can see some darker shapes as you look along the Mediterranean coast, and some of them are just different reefs of different kinds and things like that. But some of them are a little bit too straight and rigid and connected to be natural reefs. What we find just off the coast of Caesarea National Park are the ancient remains of the deep sea harbor that Herod built there. And so as we visit, you can actually walk out onto the promontory here. You can take a look around, and you can actually see the ruins of the ancient deep sea harbor right there in the water. And it's so very cool. So we're gonna, one of the features here on Google Earth is that I can click this little person over here in the bottom right-hand corner, and then I'll click one of these dots, and it's going to take us to a street level view of what we can see here. And I'm not sure whether we can see, you can see under the water there, you can see some of the remains of the harbor, but also as we take a look around, you can do a little fishing. Yeah. But as we take a look around here, you can see the more modern promontory, the walk out to the harbor. But then we can just kind of get a sense of where we are. We can take a look back toward the east of the ancient ruins of the city. And the ancient city stretched just about as far as we can see to the north and just about as far as we can see to the south. So there's Google Earth for you. I hope that was okay. Okay. All right, back to the show. Is that okay? Okay. Okay, so what we find as we, again, bring our scope out, and a couple of reminders here. Herod was an extraordinarily paranoid person. I made the argument last week that paranoia was actually well-founded. He was a dangerous person living in a very dangerous time. He was surrounded by what Jesus would call wars and rumors of wars. Both the lines of different kingdoms and also political alliances were shifting and taking different shape all the time. And so Herod, although he was paranoid enough to kill many of the members of his own family, was probably justified in being a little worried that at some point, some kind of foreign army, whether it be the Parthians or the Egyptians or whomever, were going to come marching into Jerusalem, which again lies at the crossroads between the entire African subcontinent, the Asian continent, and the European continent. And so it's not totally far-fetched to think that at some point somebody was going to come marching into Jerusalem to depose him. In order to get our bearings, we'll take a look at a map from about the year 60 BC, just before Rome became a real empire, back when it was a republic. And you can see this is just before the time that Herod ascended into power. We can see the extent of the Roman Republic in pink. We can also see these different territories called disputed territories and dependent states. These were the kinds of things that decade by decade shifted and moved and took on different shapes. And that took place by wars. Different people bringing war to their neighbors, or the Romans bringing war in order to conquer a place, or the shifting line back and forth between the Roman and the Parthian Empire, which we've talked about in recent weeks. And so this truly was a very dangerous place. You can see here on the key to the map, major battles of Julius Caesar, and one of those happened in Alexandria, one of the biggest battles in history between pro-Roman forces and pro-Egyptian forces. There were actually two different factions of Roman forces fighting there along with Egyptians. And so again, we can see that although Herod was sort of paranoid, that in some ways that was justified. We can see it certainly in his buildings like the Antonia fortress on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which we'll get to next week. And then we're going to be able to see that in Caesarea Maritima as well. So a quick pause here at the Antonia fortress in Jerusalem. This is a recreation of the fortress. It's second to Masada, just about the first fortress that Herod would build for himself. It was right in the city center of Jerusalem, right on the Temple Mount. And notice how it's named Antonia. It was named before Herod actually swore allegiance to Octavian, who would eventually go on to become Caesar Augustus. This was named when Herod still had some allegiance to somebody named Mark Antony, who was still vying for the right to be the first emperor of Rome. And so this was named Antonia after Mark Antony in order to honor Mark Antony. And then just a few years later, when it came time to build the port city that Herod was all excited about, he decided to name it after the Caesar, Octavian, who had changed his name then to Caesar Augustus. And so he named it Caesarea to sort of honor his new political alliance with the man who was now the Roman emperor. Caesarea Maritima means Caesar of the sea, which is not just a Caesar salad with tuna on it, but it's also the name of this amazing port city. This is an upside down look, if you will. This is looking from north to south, clearly, since the land is off to the left there, but just another drawing of Caesarea Maritima. But when we take a look at Caesarea Maritima, we are looking at a truly Roman city. And we would have to say that in size and scope, even compared to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which is absolutely ginormous, Caesarea Maritima was Herod's biggest undertaking. And it was his attempt to be thought of as truly legitimate, one of the greatest kings in the world. This is the product of a swelled ego as well as an artistic mind, as we know that Herod the Great had a key role to play in the designing and the layout and the choosing the materials for the buildings, in the building of the harbor itself. And so we'll get into some of those things. But first, a little bit of prehistory history. The place where Caesarea Maritima is now was actually founded by the Phoenician city-state called Sidon, which is a major player in the Old Testament, especially if you think about prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel, who talk specifically and often about Sidon. It was named after their king, King Straton I. And it was very simple. It consisted only of a very small harbor and a very small lighthouse. The lighthouse, of course, not like we know today, but really just a big fire on top of a pillar. It was abandoned shortly after it was founded and built, though, because of how rough the waves are in this part of the Mediterranean Sea. The Mediterranean Sea is known as extraordinarily rough waters. Just read the book of Acts and hear about all the shipwrecks that Paul and others were a part of to know just how harsh of conditions it is to try to build on the Mediterranean coast, but especially here. And so this place was abandoned for quite some time. Nearby, there were harbors that were built by the Phoenicians, the Persians, the Greeks, and the early Romans, which tells you how important this was as a hub of trade, so that Egyptians and others could trade their wares around the Mediterranean. Many would say that the Roman Empire was so successful because of their sea travel and sea trade. And so the area nearby to Straton's Tower, kept its name, was always thought of as an important port. Again, it's very strategically located. So lots of ships came and went around this area in many different ideations of different harbors and things. It's very nearby to a surviving port city in the Holy Land in Israel, a place that used to be called Joppa, but is now called Haifa, is very nearby. But the Hasmonean dynasty really took it over. I think it's worthwhile to point out that what you're looking at is a map of ancient Israel and Judah, the major states of the Old Testament, both the northern and the southern kingdom. But if you notice their maps, you would notice that although they're situated very close to the Mediterranean Sea, that really neither one of them, Judah not at all, and Israel really minimally, has any coastline. And I wonder, I'm going to pause for a second and ask, can anybody think of an Old Testament story, a story of the Hebrew people out sailing ships? Anybody? Anybody? I feel like Ferris Bueller's teacher. Anyone? Anyone? You're right. There really aren't any. There's some, the one that was mentioned here in the room was Jonah. And I think that that's a really important thing to point out. Other than like the prehistory flood story that we hear about in Genesis, which is the ark, that's not what we're talking about here. But in the stories of ancient Israel, we don't hear about people sailing around on ships. Again, it's odd because the ancient kingdom of Israel and Judah are so close to the sea, but in fact, those ancient Hebrew people were not seafaring people. They had very little interest in anything having to do with getting on a boat. In fact, the story of Jonah has some underlying currents, and the scholars will tell you this, some underlying currents that will tell you it is bad luck and against God's will to get on a boat. I mean, look what happened to Jonah. The sea became rough and he got thrown off. Of course, he was supposed to be headed the other direction, but there are certainly underlying tones in the story of Jonah. The Israelites just do not belong on ships. And so really in the ancient history of the Bible, you just don't hear a lot of stories of people taking to the seas and engaging in sea trade, really at all. So I think that that's important to point out. Under Herod the Great, as he helped to set the boundaries of his own empire, he insisted on quite a bit of coastline because he knew, again, not very interested in the old scriptures or some of the old myths that had kind of come up underneath those scriptures, but very interested in making money and very interested in having more prestige and esteem around the empire. He saw to it that he would have much more coastline than the original inhabitants of Israel and Judah would. Eventually, this part of the empire was quote unquote autonomized or taken over by the Romans in 63. But generally in the 1st century BC, this part of the coast was considered Phoenician Syria until Herod the Great came along. And in 22 BC, Herod began to rebuild and to fortify the city that was once known as Straton's Tower. You can see here another map of the coastline in Herod's Judea. And Herod clearly had a plan in mind. In 22 BCE, he began to rebuild and fortify this city, and he would turn it into a truly amazing Roman seaport that the emperor himself could be proud of. And so today we're going to take a look at the temple that was built there. We're going to take a look at the harbor, of course, and the Hippodrome a bit, and the palace a bit. And then we're also going to take a look at the city's post-Herod history. This city was home to Pontius Pilate, for example. This city winds up in Acts a lot, as Paul spent over 2 years here in the city and left from here several times. I'm going to pause for a moment and leave a little room for any questions or comments that you might have to this point. Okie dokie. Herod had plans early on for a port city. In fact, we have some idea that letters were going back and forth between Herod and his BFF up in Rome, the emperor, about building a port city here. The Roman emperor Augustus was extremely interested in having a bigger, better port to trade some of the wares of Rome into the Holy Land and the surrounding area, and vice versa. It's much easier, for example, to get to Egypt from here than it is from Rome. And so they were in conversation about how to make this happen. And early on, Herod was sending some preliminary or kind of prototype drawings of what he envisioned to be the ideal Roman port city. And the construction actually began in 22 BC, but the building came about actually in 2 phases. And if you think back to our time talking about Masada and the way that it was constructed, I wonder, can you tell me what was the first thing that Herod built? Can anybody tell? What was the first thing? The wall, exactly. Build that wall, Herod. Herod, being a paranoid person, wanting to protect the building project that was going on and the workers. Remember, this was also something that was built by the 18,000 person workforce that he employed for projects like this. So wanting to protect them and wanting to protect the materials and the transportation of materials and things like that. The first thing that he built was another casemate wall. It again was over a mile long. It's actually stunningly close to the length of the wall at the top of the Masada plateau, almost exactly a mile long. It was 6 feet thick in one wall and a few feet thick on the secondary wall. It was 10 feet high, made of brick and mortar and covered over with a roof. Every 30 feet within this wall, there were towers interchanging circular and rectangular shapes. There were 2 gates, only 2, one at the very north and one at the very south. And so the road that you can see going in there was added later. You can see that it's marked as a modern road. There was only room for gates at the very north and the very south. Okay. So first we're going to take a look at the temple directly at the mouth of the water. And at the head of the city's streets, Herod began construction on a temple. And for those of you who are biblically astute, might say, a temple, that's weird. The temple is in Jerusalem. Why would he want to build a temple? Well, was this a temple to Yahweh? No. Remember, this is right in the center of Herod's reign. He began in about 37 BC. He died in 4 BC. The construction here began in 22. So we're right in the middle of his reign. And what we can see here is his drifting away from his appeasing of his Jewish subjects and more toward appeasing the Romans and the emperor and the governors and people like that. And so this was not a temple to Yahweh. This was a temple to Caesar himself. It was actually a dual temple. One, it was a temple to Caesar, and secondarily, it was a temple to Rome herself, who was an ancient goddess for whom the city of Rome was named. We'll get to that in just a moment. You can see in this diagram that what is labeled C was the temple. So you can see it's right at the head of the waters. The temple was built such that as you entered the port, you came face to face with this massive structure. It sat on a platform raised about 40 feet above sea level at that time. The platform was 400 by 400 feet and supported a flat roof structure with over 200 columns that raised up 20 feet. It gave most of the courtyard kind of an open air feel. And the temple itself was right in the center of the courtyard, and it measured 140 feet by 90 feet wide. It was over 60 feet tall with 28 massive columns, and those are these Corinthian columns that you can see around the interior portion of the courtyard here in this picture. And these 28 massive columns held up a pinnacled roof. The whole structure was made, just as these Corinthian columns are that you can see there, from local Kirkar stones. They're these beautiful white marble stones. They were overlaid with an expensive white plaster. Most of the city of Caesarea was overlaid with this white plaster, and much of the city was built from this same kind of stone, especially in the downtown area. So it gave the city a look of regalness, but also regality. It gleamed in the sun. If any folks have seen pictures of some of the Greek Isles with these white buildings, they just shine in the Mediterranean sun. That's what Caesarea Maritima was all about. There were two, you can see over on your left-hand side in this imagined reconstruction of the city, you can see on the left-hand side the temple structure. And you can sort of kind of see the outer columns supporting a courtyard, and then the inner temple itself. Here's a look at a reconstructed drawing of what that would have looked like. And again, for people in the ancient world, people who have never seen, Lord of the Rings and stuff, this was just absolutely astounding. To set foot in a structure like this would just absorb a person in being there. And still today, to be in a standing building like this is totally amazing. Although it's not as big as the state capitol downtown in Raleigh, it had this beautiful ancient and white stone feel to it. Inside the temple itself, there were two statues, a giant statue of Caesar, and he was dressed up like Zeus with the long hair and the long beard of Zeus, with sort of the regal clothing of Zeus. There's not that much of it, but so it would have done an interesting thing for ancient people visiting. It would have reminded them of Zeus. It looks very much like a statue of Zeus, but this was the facial reconstruction was the face of Caesar Augustus. And so there was a lot of important points that were being made there, that people should worship the Caesar like a god, like they would worship Zeus. The other statue that was there, and you can still see it, it's in a museum today, but it still survives, was the statue of Rome herself. Rome was an ancient goddess. Again, the name of the city of Rome came from the name of this goddess. She was a goddess of war and power. And eventually she came to sort of personify Rome herself. So there's really nothing you could do more than what Herod did to honor Caesar and Rome by building this temple. This did not go over well, obviously, with his Jewish subjects, but it won him enormous favor with the Roman state. When we're standing on the Temple Mount today, this is not the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Just want to be clear. We're going to talk a lot about the Temple Mount in Jerusalem in weeks coming up. But when we stand on the Temple Mount here in Caesarea, this is what we see when we face north. And obviously it's all in ruins. And this is what we see when we face south. You can see the more modern industrial parts of the modern city further off in the distance there. But that's just kind of the view. That'll give you the street view. So as we walk around on our tour of the grounds of Caesarea, this is what we're seeing. Very salty sea air washing in at us, but it's very beautiful. Right, any questions or comments about that section?
Do they allow you to walk in among the ruins?
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's one of those things that may have changed over the years, but when I was there in 2010, yeah, you're absolutely free to walk around. There are certain places that are roped off, either places that are actively being investigated and looked at by archaeologists, but the vast majority of the ancient ruins, you're free to walk around. You can jump up and walk on the walls if you want to, different things like that. But there's certainly, if not a sacred quality to it, there is definitely an ancient quality to it. So you find yourself kind of walking around in awe, but it's a national park. So you're kind of free to roam as you please.
Thank you.
It's probably worth noting that in between the temple and the harbor, there were huge natural gardens, and there's plaques about this when you visit, to beautify the area, but also to keep the noise from the harbor at a minimum when you're inside the temple, so it could still have that serene and worshipful feeling as much as you would in any pagan temple, I suppose. So next we're going to take a look at the harbor, and here again is a bird's eye view, sort of from north to south, but you can see the remains of the ancient harbor just underneath the waves out in the Mediterranean Sea. The modern promontory is still there. You can walk out into the sea that way. But here we can see the remains of the full harbor, and it's just really a sight to behold. When Pontius Pilate, and this is fast forwarding several decades, but when Pontius Pilate wrote back to Rome about arriving safely in Judea, he said, the first thing that we saw many miles from shore was an enormous temple, gleaming white, and I knew I was in friendly territory. So here we see a reconstruction of the harbor, but notice on the right-hand side, the first thing that you would kind of run into would be that Temple Mount. So often, in order to pay tribute to the gods, to Caesar and to Rome, a person would enter into the harbor and then walk straight up into the temple. The leading archaeologist, Ehud Netzer, who wrote the big thick book that I've been studying, says that the deepwater harbor at Caesarea was no doubt the largest, the most complicated, and the most ambitious building project undertaken by King Herod. We can see here from this reconstruction that it's generally laid out in three parts. A larger outer sort of entrance section, then an intermediary and an inner basin. As I mentioned, previous attempts at building a harbor here were pretty short-lived. They eventually failed because of the rough sea and the waves here, which are especially bad in the winter. Having been there in January, you can really feel when the waves crash in, you don't just hear them, you can actually feel them shaking the ground beneath your feet. And so Herod knew that in order to build something that would truly last, that he would have to undergo a great amount of planning and of work and true industrial genius to kind of make this happen. But Herod, who was, if not great, at least a great builder, he was up for the challenge. You can see on the left-hand side here, the harbor there in its three different parts. He began by constructing two gigantic breakwaters. For those of you who have spent time around the ocean specifically, kind of know what breakwaters are. They're these big structures that go around a harbor in order to keep the waves at bay. And he constructed two gigantic breakwater, the southern breakwater and the northern. Overall, he laid 3,000 feet of breakwater walls, 750 feet for the north and 2,250 feet for the south and the west. And in order to make this work, he had to use something that had never before been used. Is something called hydraulic concrete. And remember, this is before the time of Jesus, hydraulic concrete. In order to do that, first rectangular wooden boxes shaped like the undersides of huge ships are floated into place. They are submerged and anchored, and then using piping, concrete, which is largely made of volcanic ash, is injected into the wooden boxes up to 350 cubic feet at a time. This is done hundreds and hundreds of times. And the northern breakwater wound up being 150 feet wide, and the southern breakwater up to 600 feet wide. You can see kind of how these boxes would shape the breakwater themselves. The breakwaters were made from volcanic ash mixed with lime and pozzolana, which is special rock brought in from Italy and it is igneous rock, so it's made up of volcanic ash, but it's hardened and then set underwater, and those things mesh together and settle together and make concrete. Herod imported over 75,000 cubic feet of pozzolana from Pozzuoli, Italy, and a shipment of this size would have required at least 44 shiploads of 400 tons each. So there you can see a recreation of the harbor. Again, this is a view from the north to the south, but you can see that the northern, that would be down toward the bottom of our screens, the northern breakwater being about 150 feet in width, and the southern and western being up to 600 feet in width. So you have the harbor itself, but then you have this underlying concrete all the way around that keeps the waters from destroying the walls. Once the concrete dried, stone blocks weighing anywhere from 90 to 110 tons were placed on top of the concrete, and then smaller stones on top, which made the breakwaters 30 feet above the water line. And it created an enormous barrier between the angry sea and the harbor itself. You can also see in the bottom portion of this picture, the opening. This would be the harbor opening, and it was 60 feet wide. It's on the northwest side, and it was at that time easily wide enough for the largest ships in the Roman fleet to pass through. Herod named the harbor Sebaste, which is a Greek version of the name Augustus, and it's thought that on top of the breakwater promontories, he put up 6 enormous statues. Although the identities of these statues remain unknown, it's believed that one was Drusian, one of Caesar's sons who had died in battle. You can always tell Pastor Ben's pictures original because they're not any good. But as you're walking out onto the promontory, this is what you can see. Oh, that one's better, but it's not mine. So these are the promontories. You can still walk out into the sea and kind of see the remains of the harbor. Just beyond that, you can find some warehouses important to keep near to the harbor itself so that all the goods being brought in can be stored before being shipped out to other places or brought either by camel or other animals to other places in caravans. This was also where all the merchandise that came into the harbor was counted. And remember last week we asked the question, how did Herod pay for all of these building projects? Well, taxes, his inheritance, but also levies from shipping were a huge part of his income. It made him, on a continuing basis, fabulously wealthy, enough to build entire cities. And so this is where everything would be counted and the levies would be calculated. Yeah. So again, here's that imagined reconstruction of what this looked like. We know that there was a tower at the westernmost point, a lighthouse that burned continually that would have left the sky, as you can see here, extremely black out toward the water, but the wind blowing the way that it does there, it would be sort of cycling away from the city at all times. But here you get a sense of the statues and kind of what it would have looked like at that time. Questions, comments?
Honestly, the scope of all this built by hand is just overwhelming.
It is.
I mean, it's just unbelievable.
Yeah.
They did all this.
Truly, truly. Yeah, without any modern machinery, a lot of sore backs from those who were employed to do this work. But also, I hope that we're gleaning a sense of the engineering genius that it took to do this. This was before A lot of work had been done with locks and dams and things like that, but it was thought that they could at different times control the level of the water. Even during storms, ships could come safely into the harbor without running aground. And yeah, so the engineering and the work involved and just the scope of it is truly enormous. Next thing we'll take a look at, and this will probably be quick so that we can get all the way through the material, would be the Hippodrome. It's found just south of the temple structure here in the city. It would certainly double as a stadium as well. Hippodromes in the Roman Empire and the Greeks before them were used for horse and chariot racing. So they're very long and they always have kind of the same look to them. Whenever you're visiting any kind of Greek or Roman ruins, you can always find the Hippodrome in a city. It's this long flat surface with stadium seating around it. It has poles erected in the center where ropes would be tied so that the horses and chariots could do their racing around. So that's what a hippodrome is. This would have also been a stadium for some other things as well, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Caesarea's hippodrome runs north and south, as all good hippodromes do. So that's another way to locate hippodromes if you're looking around any ancient ruins from this time. The hippodrome is always running north and south. What that does is that it avoids the sun in the eyes of the racers. So from north to south, this particular hippodrome was about 1,000 feet. From east to west, it was about 210 feet, and the arena area, or the floor or track, was about 900 feet by 150 feet. The western wall of the hippodrome helped to form a fortification wall. So it was just like the synagogue at Masada was, if you remember that. It kind of naturally became part of the outer casemate wall. And it also helped to brace against the rising waves of the Mediterranean. So while people were watching the horse races and the chariot races, they could hear and again even feel the waves of the Mediterranean coming up at their backs. In front of the seats was a 4-foot high wall, which separated spectators from the action, and holes found in the top of this wall suggest that poles holding up nets were put in place during wild animal shows for the protection of the people who were sitting there. The seating blocks raised about 35 feet high and contained 12 rows of seats. This is probably a better picture for all this. And given some of the niches in the stone seating, it's thought that each one of the people there was allowed about 14 inches of sitting space, allowing about 12,000 people at a time. And I don't know if you can measure with your hands 14 inches, but it's just a little bit. These were thinner people than I am, but 14 inches was enough for your average ancient Roman. Above the stone seating platforms was a partial ceiling, on top of which other seats could be sat for dignitaries and Herodian family members. This would not be the upper ceiling that you see there, but kind of a half ceiling above, in order to above the main seating, in order to create kind of boxes for the dignitaries and Roman officials and things to watch the games from. In 10 BC, Herod instituted, this is a hard word to say, so I'm going to try, the quinquennial games, to be held every 5 years in honor of the Caesar. It was a direct reflection of the Olympic Games that the Greeks were so fond of, and it lavished wealth and fame on the winners of these games. Among the different events would be racing, discus, archery, charioteering, and wrestling. And athletes from all over Rome would travel around from hippodrome to hippodrome to these games, making Caesarea and its hippodrome a center of athletics in the ancient world. So we've got the Olympics on TV these days. So this is the ancient Roman version of those games. Questions, comments? Oh yeah, there you go.
Just to let you know, seating wise, 14 inches. I used to build a lot of stadiums. The smallest seat we ever put in was 18 at 17 inches, and a generous seat is 21 or 22 inches. So
Yeah,
14 would be very small people and mushed together.
Mushed together. Yes, yes. That's why they could fit 12,000 people into this hippodrome. Thank you for that perspective, Tommy. I need one of those 22-inch seats, but 14 inches is right out for me. A couple looks here at the hippodrome. See how close it is to the sea? You can actually see the Mediterranean on the far left side of your picture there. There you go. Quinquennial. Say that 10 times fast. Do your best. The next thing that we'll take a look at is the Promontory Palace. It will remind us a bit of the palace that we saw at Masada on the northern side of Masada, which was 3-tiered layers built naturally into the existing rock formations there. This is what's called a promontory palace, and it's definitely worth mentioning. It's built more for a lavish lifestyle than it is really for security, but it's a clear reminder to us of Herod's ego. It is built on a natural promontory. You can see it. This is a north-south reconstruction, and you can see the promontory there toward the bottom of the picture, and that's where the palace sat. It juts out right into the ocean. It has dimensions of 300 feet by 150 feet. These days, much of it has been washed away by the waves. But the first section of the palace to be built, which started along with the wall construction in 22 BCE, was called the Lower Palace. It was located solely on the jutting out rock into the Mediterranean. And this wing of the palace measured about 240 feet by 165 feet. It was made of that same Kirkar stone quarried nearby that the rest of the town was made of, and overlaid with plaster much the same way, so it would gleam bright white in the sun. It consisted of a series of rooms that you can kind of see laid out there. It consisted of a series of rooms located around a central court occupied by a rock-cut pool filled with fresh water. It was equal size these days to an Olympic swimming pool, and it was 6 feet deep. A large hall was also present. Adjacent to the pool was smaller rooms for political meetings and things like that. There was a semicircular face to the side of that, which looked out onto the sea. And so again, we would have to imagine, but we imagine a very beautiful space for politicians and dignitaries to gather and to meet with Herod or his inner court. There's a reconstruction of what that palace would have looked like. Once the idea was solidified to hold the quinquennial games at Caesarea, it was clear that more would be needed from Herod's palace. The lower palace has no huge reception room for foreign dignitaries, so another adjacent palace would be needed to do those things. The second phase of building for the palace was needed and took place between 11 and 9 BC. It took about 2 years to build. This upper palace was built on the higher rock plateau to the east of the promontory, and it featured a large open-air courtyard for entertaining and a series of large rooms for housing and meeting with important guests. Herod spent a lot of time here, much more than he would have spent at Masada, for example. This is much easier to get to. It's much easier to keep stocked with all the things that you would need for a king and his court and officials and foreign dignitaries to spend time. He lived here for a majority of some of the years of his reign, just leaving Jerusalem to its own politics. But it's kind of a good segue into our next segment as well. There's a look at both the lower palace that's mostly been washed away and the upper palace, which is sort of still intact, although you can see through erosion that A corner of it's been kind of eaten away there. Part of that was an Olympic swimming pool at one point. Oh yeah, there it is. Once again, a reminder that the palaces, even of the greatest kings and dignitaries, eventually wash away. I'm leave it on this picture for just a moment. Other historically important things and biblically important things happened other than Herod living here. Paul was held here under Roman authority for 2 years. The aqueduct, the theater, the amphitheater, they're all worth talking about, but I don't think that we'll be able to. We have kind of limited time. So we'll turn now to the historical importance of the place. Caesarea Maritima was Herod's most expansive building project. It leaves a legacy in his honor. Even if we don't honor him that much, we can honor the genius and the engineering that it took to put this together. In the eyes of the Romans and their people, it was the main city in Judea, not Jerusalem, but Caesarea. The Jews knew Jerusalem remained their spiritual home, but Jerusalem would also always stand as a reminder of Herod's brutality. 2 of the 3 sons that Herod killed were executed here in this place, in the capital city of, not here in Caesarea, but in Jerusalem, far away from this place. And this place was seen as a little bit, I think in the time, a little bit more of a dignified modern city, and Jerusalem was seen as kind of a spiritual capital. By the time that Herod's son Archelaus had ruled and been kicked out of Jerusalem, Caesarea had grown to be one of the largest port cities in the Roman Empire. Given its truly Roman nature and the ease of accessibility from sailing to and from Rome, Caesarea became the Roman capital of Judea in 6 AD in an official way. What that means is that all the Roman governors, like Pontius Pilate, ruled from this city. And in 1961, the Pilate stone was discovered here. So I've got a couple pictures here of the Pilate stone. Remember that according to scripture, Pilate was only visiting Jerusalem in order to keep an eye on the crowd for Passover when Jesus was arrested. In fact, all 9 of the Roman procurators, legates, and prefects between 680 and 135 AD ruled Judea from this place, from Caesarea, not from Jerusalem. During the 3rd century, Caesarea was a center of Christian learning. In the 4th century, the site converted to Christianity and became a major center of the Christian Roman Empire. So what we see here, and it's written in Latin, so it's very hard to make out. But what we have here is perhaps not a headstone, but some kind of a memorial stone for Pontius Pilate, who ruled here for many years. And what you can see in the Latin that's carved into the stone is the name Pontius Pilatus. And then it gives all of his different titles and different things like that. Can you see on the top line, and definitely on the second line, I think it's a little clearer. You can see Pilatus, and it's thought that before that are the letters Pontius, Pontius Pilatus, and so it's an important historical verification of Pontius Pilate and where he lived and what he did. Of course, we know him as the one who tried and eventually executed Jesus, but this is an important connection to the past. And it's on display out in the open here at Caesarea. But again, we think of Caesarea in biblical terms as the place where Paul was held a prisoner. It's both practical and symbolic for the early church. In Acts 21, we hear that there was a gathering of disciples at Caesarea. It can be a little confusing because in the Gospels, we hear about places like Caesarea Philippi, which is far up to the north. But especially in the book of Acts, when we hear about Caesarea, it's talking about this city, Caesarea Maritima. We hear about a gathering of disciples at Caesarea. Later, we hear that Philip the evangelist actually lived there. More than anything, though, it acts as a port into and out of which the early Christian apostles were sent. This was the go-to city, the go-between city for Israel and Judea and the rest of the world. In fact, what is sometimes thought of as another important port, Joppa, is only mentioned once in Acts chapter 10. But Caesarea is also mentioned in Acts chapter 10, and it tells of Cornelius, a Gentile in Caesarea, who was a good and faithful Christian who lived here in this place and hosted the apostles regularly, and also helped to send them out into the world. So among the exports of this area, we could say that stone and crops and gold and different things were very important, but its most important export was certainly Christianity. If Paul was indeed sailing from here to places like Rome and modern day Turkey, places like Corinth and others, then we know that Christianity itself, the gospel good news of Jesus Christ, was exported from this harbor. And so we can see how God uses even the madness, the paranoia, and I suppose the genius of Herod for God's own purposes, because this became the central point from which the story about Jesus would be made known to the world. Acts chapter 11, verses 11 and 12, Peter tells a story of going to Caesarea with the Gentiles, and it says, "At that very moment, 3 men sent from Caesarea arrived at the house where we were. The Spirit told me to go with them and to not make distinction between them and us." And what he means there is no distinction between the Hebrew people of the Old Testament covenant and the Gentiles. It was in this place that Peter felt the Spirit move him to combine the Gentile and the Jewish churches into one Christian church. You could also say historically that Herod's grandson Agrippa died here and was eaten by worms. That whole thing, that took place in Caesarea. And it stands as a testimony that the power and the prestige of this world is somehow disconnected from the eternal power of God's kingdom. And again, that God will use even the madness of the king and the paranoia of the king into God's own purposes. And so from Caesarea Maritima, we hear about teaching, we hear about unity in the church, and we hear about the gospel message being sent everywhere, which I think is truly the riches of this place, is thinking about how the Christian church itself departed from this port and was sent out into the world as good news. Okay, we're a few minutes past our time. Sorry about that. Are there any questions or comments as we wrap up tonight?
Yeah, seeing all those ruins and how you keep saying that those kingdoms built by man have fallen down, but God's kingdom just continues. And that I kept thinking about that the whole time. All these amazing buildings, and they're just gone.
Yeah. I think about the statues too. I mean, that 30 to 40 foot statue of Zeus/Caesar. We don't even know where that is. I mean,
that was ridiculous. That was ridiculous.
That's not even around anymore.
That's true.
But the good news of Christ is, and maybe more powerful than ever. And so that's the true power of this place.
Yeah.
Other questions or comments before we finish up? I mentioned Herod's paranoia at the end there a couple times. I kind of skipped over the part at the beginning, mapping out how this would be, for example, when Augustus made the comment, Herod, he said this publicly, Herod should have more land than he does. He ought to rule over the Egyptians and the Syrians too. That was very near to the time of 22 BC when Herod started building the city. And since it's north and toward the coast from Jerusalem, we can easily imagine this city as his flee away from the city of Jerusalem north, and he can jump on a ship and make it to Rome within a few days. So that's why I mentioned paranoia a couple times there. But again, God uses all that for good in the end. Okay, anything else? We'll finish with a word of prayer. We'll continue next time. We'll probably go ahead and jump into our staycation through Jerusalem. I really want to take a really solid look at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which as a testimony of religion and whatever that has to do with faith, is Herod's most monumental work. Not the kind of scope that this whole city and harbor is, but I think it'll be worthwhile for us to spend a couple of weeks on that. So let's pray, and I'll see you next week. Gracious God, send us forward from here, just as the apostles were sent out from the harbor at Caesarea, proclaiming the good news of Christ in this world. Oh God, we need this good news, maybe more than ever. And so help us to act out and to live the gospel and to proclaim it. Oh God, help us to be fearless as we do so. Oh God, as we feel the waves, like the waves on the Mediterranean, crashing us about, help us to stay steadfast in the good news of Christ. It's in his name that we live and pray. Amen.